The first-class cabin of Solaris Air was a realm of opulence, where the hum of the engines blended with the soft rustle of champagne flutes. The warm amber glow of the cabin lights bathed the passengers in an almost surreal calm, making it hard to imagine that beneath the polished surface, tensions were already brewing. At seat 4B, Maya Ellison sat with perfect composure, her silk blouse catching the light as she adjusted her seatbelt. She was the picture of understated elegance, a billionaire, the CEO of Solaris Air, yet she blended in seamlessly with the other high-powered passengers around her. No one would guess that she was the woman who had built this airline from the ground up. Her wealth, like her presence, moved quietly, beneath the surface, unassuming yet powerful. The flight had just begun, and the cabin was filled with the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle whoosh of the air conditioning. Maya leaned back in her seat, her brown eyes scanning the horizon outside, a serene mask hiding the storm of thoughts inside. She had fought hard to get here, not just to the seat 4B on this luxurious flight, but to the top of the business world. Yet, as always, it seemed that her skin color was a silent challenge for some people, a thing that set her apart in spaces that were never designed for someone like her. It was an old song, one she had heard far too many times. The weight of eyes upon her, the subtle but persistent judgments. Today it was no different. Suddenly the tranquility was shattered. Karen White, the senior flight attendant with over 25 years of service, strode down the aisle with an air of authority, her navy uniform pressed to perfection. Her silver name tag gleamed under the soft lighting as she passed Maya's seat. But then something shifted in the air, a sense of foreboding that Maya couldn't quite place. Karen's sharp gaze flickered toward her, pausing briefly before her lips curled into a thin smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, the smile of someone used to power and control. She stopped in front of Maya's seat, her posture rigid. Without any warning, Karen's voice broke the calm. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone stiff, almost clipped. "I'm going to need to check your boarding pass again. This seat has been assigned to someone else." The words were calm but carried an undeniable edge, a tone that dared Maya to question her authority. Maya's eyes narrowed just slightly, but her expression remained unchanged. It was clear. Karen had made an assumption, one that Maya had encountered countless times in her life, the subtle, unspoken belief that someone like her didn't belong in places like this. As the words hung in the air, Maya didn't react immediately. She simply looked at Karen, a steady, unflinching gaze, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, as if waiting for Karen to prove her point. The tension between them grew palpable, and passengers around them began to take notice. Some glanced over nervously, sensing the potential for confrontation, while others pretended not to notice, their eyes glued to their screens or books, avoiding the uncomfortable air that had suddenly settled over the cabin. Yet it was clear, this wasn't just about a seat. There was something deeper at play, something that neither of them would say, but both understood all too well. "Ma'am," Karen said again, a little louder this time, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "I need you to confirm that this is your seat. There seems to be some mistake." The challenge was issued, and she stood there, waiting for Maya to back down. Maya's fingers tightened on the armrest, a subtle but telling shift. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she calmly leaned forward, her gaze meeting Karen's with quiet intensity. "My boarding pass is on the floor where you left it," she said, her voice low and steady. "Pick it up, and you'll see I belong here." The words landed with precision, cutting through the tension like a knife. A ripple of whispers ran through the cabin as passengers exchanged glances. Some seemed to recoil, others seemed intrigued, but none dared to speak up. All eyes were on Karen now, waiting for her next move. Karen's jaw tightened, a faint flush of pink creeping up her neck. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of passengers who relied on her to maintain order and control. The flicker of uncertainty passed quickly, masked by the practiced smirk she flashed in Maya's direction. Her fingers trembled slightly as she bent to retrieve the boarding pass from the floor. She held it up, scanning it with an almost exaggerated slowness. The moment seemed to stretch on, as though the cabin was holding its breath. Seat 4B, first class, fully confirmed, Karen muttered, her voice clipped. She scanned it once more, her eyes narrowing, searching for any sign of error, any possible justification for her actions. But there was nothing. The boarding pass was legitimate. The seat was Maya's, just as it had been when she first boarded the plane. Karen's eyes flicked up to Maya's, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something like doubt, but it quickly vanished. She wasn't about to admit she was wrong. Not now, not in front of everyone. So instead, she doubled down. "This looks irregular," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'll have to call a gate agent to verify. This is standard procedure." Her words were sharp, dripping with an edge of condescension, as if Maya was the one at fault, as if Maya had somehow manipulated the system to claim a seat she didn't deserve. The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, but Maya remained unmoved. She didn't react to the implication, didn't rise to the bait. Her eyes never left Karen's, and for a moment, the cabin felt as though it were frozen in place, caught in the middle of something that could spiral out of control at any second. Tim Ruiz, a junior flight attendant who had been standing nearby, appeared from the galley. He hesitated at the edge of the aisle, unsure of what was unfolding, but clearly aware that the situation was tense. Maya could see the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. He was still new, still learning how to navigate the unspoken dynamics of the crew, especially the iron grip Karen held over them. Karen's voice snapped him out of his hesitation. "Tim," she barked, "get the scanner. We need to verify this pass. Now." The command was clear, but there was something in her tone that bordered on desperation. She needed validation, needed to prove she wasn't wrong. Tim hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding, walking briskly to retrieve the handheld scanner. Maya's gaze followed him, her mind already working through the next move. This wasn't just about the seat. It never had been. This was a game of power, and Maya knew how to play it. As Tim returned, Maya remained seated, her posture relaxed, her face an unreadable mask. The moment was almost surreal. She could feel the weight of the entire cabin's attention, but she didn't break. Instead, she simply waited, knowing the storm was far from over. As the handheld scanner beeped, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Tim Ruiz, the junior flight attendant, stood frozen in the aisle with the scanner in his hand, his eyes flickering nervously between Maya and Karen. The device had just confirmed what Maya had known all along. Her boarding pass was valid, her seat was hers. But the silence that followed the beep was heavy, pregnant with tension. Maya leaned back slightly in her seat, her fingers still resting lightly on the armrest, as if the world itself were waiting for Karen to concede. Karen, however, was anything but willing to admit defeat. Her jaw tightened, and her pale blue eyes flared with a brief flash of irritation. She didn't want to be wrong. She couldn't afford to be wrong, not in front of the passengers who were now watching this scene unfold. With a stiff, controlled motion, she took the scanner from Tim's hand, her nails clicking against the device. She examined it, her lips twitching into a forced smile. "This must be a glitch," Karen said, her voice tight and insistent, but still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. She pressed the device's screen, swiping at it like a woman trying to erase the evidence in front of her. "I've seen this happen before. These machines aren't perfect." Her tone was laced with a sense of superiority, trying to reassure herself more than anyone else. Maya didn't flinch. She could see it now, the way Karen was trying to manipulate the situation, the way she was doubling down instead of admitting her mistake. It was almost predictable. Maya had been in the boardrooms of powerful men and women who did the same thing. They would twist the narrative, deny what was right in front of them, and use their power to control the story. But Maya wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't someone who could be intimidated or brushed aside. And Karen wasn't about to take this victory from her. "Karen," Maya's voice cut through the tension like a knife, cool and unwavering. "If the scanner is broken, you can always check the manifest. You could verify my seat the old-fashioned way." Her words were measured, calm, but they carried a weight that made it clear she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. Not now, not ever. The room seemed to exhale collectively, passengers now watching with bated breath as Karen's fingers trembled slightly, betraying her calm facade. She could feel the shift, the subtle change in the air. Maya wasn't just a passenger. Maya was something far more powerful than that, and Karen could feel it. The quiet strength that Maya exuded, a force of nature in the calm before the storm. Karen stood still for a moment, weighing her options. She had already lost control of the narrative once. The scanner had betrayed her, and now Maya was daring her to go even further, to continue her attack. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she took a deep breath, forcing the tension out of her shoulders. This wasn't over. She would make sure of it. Fine, Karen finally said, though the word was more of a declaration than an admission. She motioned for Tim to get the manifest. If you insist on making this difficult, we'll do it your way. Tim hesitated for a moment, clearly caught between his loyalty to Karen and the mounting discomfort he felt in his gut. He looked to Maya, his brown eyes filled with uncertainty, before he reluctantly turned and walked to the galley to retrieve the flight's manifest. Maya didn't move, her gaze unwavering as she watched him go. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was a battle for control, and Maya was determined to win. As the seconds ticked by, the passengers continued to watch the unfolding drama, their eyes flicking between Karen, Maya, and the flight attendants who were now subtly observing the situation. There was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Some passengers whispered to one another, others remained stone silent. But it was clear, Karen's authority was slipping, and Maya had every intention of making sure it stayed that way. Tim returned moments later, holding the manifest in his hands, his movements hesitant. The cabin was filled with the hum of soft whispers, as passengers, sensing a shift, leaned in a little closer to watch the unfolding scene. Tim handed the manifest to Karen, his eyes downcast, avoiding Maya's unwavering gaze. Karen took the papers with a stiff nod, her fingers gripping them tightly as if they were a lifeline. "Here we go," Karen muttered, scanning the document with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She flipped through the pages, the rustle of the paper filling the silence. Maya sat still, her fingers delicately tracing the edge of her bracelet. The quiet confidence in her demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic search for a way out. Finally, Karen stopped flipping, her eyes landing on the confirmation for seat 4B. "Well, I suppose the manifest says you're right," she said, but her tone lacked sincerity. She couldn't admit that she had made a mistake. Not after everything. Instead, she pressed on, her eyes flashing with something darker now. "But there's still something about this. It just doesn't feel right." Maya raised an eyebrow at her, the challenge clear in her eyes. "It doesn't feel right," she repeated slowly, her voice calm but carrying an edge that could not be ignored. "Maybe that's because you've already made up your mind about who belongs here, Karen. It's not about my ticket. It's about your assumptions." The words hung in the air, and Maya could see the shift in the cabin once again. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Karen and Maya. A few exchanged glances, and Maya could feel the weight of the room's judgment beginning to tip in her favor. She knew exactly what was happening now. Karen was trying to reassert control, but in doing so, she was revealing herself more and more. The facade was cracking, and Maya was going to make sure it shattered. Karen's cheeks flushed, a slight tremor in her hand as she pressed the manifest to her chest. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her breath, but the confidence she had once carried with ease was now slipping away. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll call the gate agent to confirm once more, just to be sure." Maya's expression remained impassive, but inside a quiet triumph stirred. She knew Karen was stalling, and she was getting closer to the moment when everything would come to light. But she wasn't about to make this easy for Karen. "If you'd like to verify my seat again," Maya said smoothly, "you're welcome to call whoever you need. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm in my seat, Karen, and I'd like to stay here for the rest of this flight." Her words were not just a declaration. They were a challenge, one that Karen would have no choice but to accept. Maya could see the war raging inside Karen's mind, her pride fighting against the undeniable truth that Maya belonged here just as much as anyone else. The silence in the cabin grew thick as the tension built. Even the flight attendants had stopped moving, watching the confrontation unfold. It was clear now that the stakes had shifted from a simple seating issue to something far more profound. Karen was no longer just trying to enforce the rules, she was fighting to maintain her power. But Maya had already made her decision. She wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else take that power away. Karen finally broke the silence, her voice forced and sharp. "Fine," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But don't think this is over. We'll see about this when we land." Maya gave her a cool, unwavering look, letting the words hang between them. She didn't need to respond. Karen's final words were nothing more than a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. But it was clear to everyone in the cabin. This confrontation wasn't over yet, and Maya had won the first round. As Karen turned to walk away, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, the cabin seemed to breathe again, though there was a quiet murmur now, a ripple of disbelief and intrigue. Maya leaned back and he. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Karen walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. The battle for control, though not over, had shifted. Maya leaned back in her seat, her fingers gently resting on her gold bracelet. The hum of the jet engines, once a comforting background, now felt like the soundtrack to an impending storm. She had won this round, but she knew better than to think Karen would back down so easily. Across the aisle, Evan Holt watched the interaction with a detached amusement, his lips curling into a faint smile. A seasoned businessman with a taste for the drama that played out in high society, Evan found this whole confrontation more entertaining than he had anticipated. He glanced at Maya, then back at Karen's retreating figure, knowing that the seasoned flight attendant wouldn't let this slide quietly. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, his eyes narrowing slightly, predicting that this little drama was far from over. In the row behind Maya, Laya Chen, the young journalist, was already tapping away at her phone, the screen reflecting the determined glint in her eyes. She had been filming since the moment Karen slapped the boarding pass to the floor. She didn't know who Maya was, not yet, but something told her this was more than just a seat dispute. This had the makings of a story far larger than she could have imagined. Laya's fingers hovered over her screen as she prepared to upload the footage, but for now she stayed silent, blending into the cabin's growing unease. Tim Ruiz, still lingering near the galley, avoided eye contact with Karen as she returned to the back of the plane. His heart was racing, a gnawing feeling settling in his stomach. The truth was clear to him now, yet his loyalty to Karen, the senior flight attendant who had long held the reins of control, made him hesitate. He had seen the scanner confirm Maya's legitimacy, yet he had obeyed Karen's orders without question. Now his role in this unfolding drama weighed heavily on him. He couldn't deny what had happened, but he wasn't sure if he had the courage to stand up to Karen when she inevitably came for him. Meanwhile, Maya remained calm, but the fight was far from over. She had faced down power before. Boardrooms, investors, even the harshest critics who thought her success was a fluke. She knew how to play the game, how to wait for her moment. Her gaze shifted to the cabin door as the flight attendants made their way down the aisle, distributing drinks and snacks, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the tense atmosphere. But nothing could erase the fact that Karen had made a grave mistake, one that she wasn't ready to own up to. The next few minutes were a blur of motion, but Maya stayed anchored in her seat, her mind calculating her next move. She knew Karen's pride would never let her admit fault, not to the passengers, not to the crew, and certainly not to Maya. But Maya also knew that her composure, her quiet strength, had unsettled Karen in a way that no one else could. The senior flight attendant was used to being in control, but she had just met someone who would not back down. As Karen disappeared into the galley, Maya's attention shifted back to the growing tension around her. The whispers among the passengers had grown louder. People were talking, exchanging opinions. Some were curious, some sympathetic, and others were simply waiting to see how this would all play out. The cabin was now divided into two camps, those who saw Karen's actions as a justified assertion of authority, and those who, like Maya, knew this was something much more sinister. And in that moment, Maya realized something. This wasn't just a matter of a seat dispute or an apology. This was a reflection of something much larger, the power dynamics at play in the world outside this plane. Karen's actions were a symptom of a deeper, more systemic issue. And it wasn't just about who belonged in first class, it was about who got to decide. Maya's mind raced, but her face remained an impenetrable mask. She knew that as soon as the plane touched down, Karen would likely escalate the situation, and the passengers, already divided, would be the ones to judge her. But this time, Maya wasn't going to let herself be the one who paid the price. Not for a mistake she hadn't made. She glanced out of the window, the endless expanse of the Pacific stretching beneath them, and took a deep breath, focusing on the calm she had mastered over the years. Across the aisle, Evan Holt leaned back in his seat, still watching the drama unfold with a bemused expression. He had seen power struggles like this before, but he couldn't help but feel a slight admiration for Maya. There was something about the way she carried herself, unbothered by the small-time theatrics happening around her. She didn't beg for attention or try to manipulate the room like so many others. She simply existed, and that was enough. Maya's eyes flicked over to Laya, who had discreetly resumed filming. The journalist hadn't been subtle in her initial reaction, and now Maya was wondering if she was in the midst of a story that could very well go viral. Laya's phone was still in her hands, and Maya caught the slight shake of her head. Clearly, the journalist was unsure about how far she should go. But Maya knew one thing for certain: the truth would eventually come to light. All she had to do was bide her time. Tim reappeared at the aisle, looking even more uncomfortable than before. His eyes met Maya's, and for a brief moment, his guilt was almost tangible. Maya offered him a small nod, acknowledging his silent apology, but she couldn't afford to wait for him to make a move. He was too caught in the gravitational pull of Karen's authority. Maya's eyes slid over to the galley where Karen was talking to another flight attendant, her posture rigid, but there was a twitch at the corner of her mouth. Her calm facade was slipping. She was frustrated, and Maya could see it. The cabin grew quiet again, the murmur of voices subsiding as the flight attendants resumed their duties. The calm was temporary, though. Maya knew Karen wouldn't let it end here. She would be back, and when she did, she would be out for blood. The thought lingered in Maya's mind for a moment, but then she pushed it aside. She wasn't about to let a petty power struggle distract her. She had bigger things to focus on, things she had worked her entire life to build. She had a company to lead, a vision to uphold, and a legacy to protect. A flight attendant's misplaced pride wasn't going to derail that. As the jet cut through the sky, the lights above flickering in rhythm with the turbulence, Maya closed her eyes briefly, letting herself center again. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was the CEO of Solaris Air, and the world would soon learn that she could play this game better than anyone else. As the flight continued, the tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. The muted hum of the engines, once a comforting presence, now seemed to echo Maya's thoughts, each passing minute building toward an inevitable confrontation. Maya sat still, her back straight, eyes fixed on the small window beside her. The world outside was endless, a vast ocean stretching below. But within the cabin, it felt as though everything had narrowed to the space around her seat, where the battle for control was quietly simmering. Karen had retreated to the galley, but Maya knew she wasn't finished. The brief moment of silence after the boarding pass debacle was only a temporary lull. Maya's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the armrest, her mind already mapping out the next steps. She had lived in a world where power, perception, and control could make or break you, and this was no different. She had grown used to being underestimated, to being viewed as an outsider in spaces where she had every right to be. But this time, she wasn't about to let it slide. Not when her seat, her dignity, and her very identity were on the line. Across the aisle, Evan Holt sipped his bourbon, his eyes flickering between Maya and the flight attendants. The businessman was a spectator in this game, but there was something in the way he watched Maya that hinted at more than just casual curiosity. It was a knowing gaze, as though he recognized the game being played. He had seen power struggles like this before, but he didn't seem to mind sitting back and watching it all unfold. After all, it wasn't his career on the line. In the back of the cabin, Tim Ruiz continued to hover, his unease visible in his posture. He had returned to his duties, but his mind wasn't on the trays of drinks he was serving. His thoughts were back with Maya, torn between his loyalty to Karen and the undeniable truth he had witnessed. He had seen her rightful seat confirmed by the scanner, but Karen's power over him was hard to break. The conflict churned in his stomach, and he couldn't help but feel guilty, knowing he had been complicit in something he felt wasn't right. Meanwhile, Laya Chen remained quiet, her phone now tucked carefully in her lap. She had captured the moment when Karen slapped Maya's boarding pass to the floor and filmed the tension that followed. But now she hesitated. The line between journalistic integrity and taking sides was growing thinner. She wasn't sure if this was just a seat dispute or something much larger. Still, she knew this was a story worth following, a story that would make waves if it reached the right people. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the conflict between Maya and Karen was about to escalate into something bigger. Karen emerged from the galley, her face tight with restrained fury. She moved down the aisle, stopping at a few rows, making sure to avoid Maya's gaze. She was trying to regain control, to pretend that everything was back to normal, but the air in the cabin had shifted. The passengers could feel it. They could sense that something wasn't right. Even Evan, who had been so entertained by the spectacle, couldn't deny the undercurrent of unease that now hung over the cabin. As Karen reached Maya's row, she hesitated for a split second, her eyes flicking over Maya before she looked away, her expression hardening. This was no longer about the seat. It was about something far more significant: power, control, and who, in this confined space, would decide who truly belonged. Maya's heart beat steadily, her breath even. She was ready. Whatever Karen was planning next, she wouldn't back down. The game had only just begun. Karen stopped at Maya's seat, her posture stiff and controlled. The air seemed to grow even heavier, thick with the knowledge that whatever happened next would determine the course of the entire flight. Maya glanced up at her, her gaze unwavering, and for a moment it felt as if the entire world had narrowed to just the two of them. The tension crackled in the space between them, a battle of wills that was about to unfold. "Excuse me, Miss Ellison," Karen said, her voice sharp and tight with restraint. "I need to remind you that your actions today have caused some disruption. I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm and cooperative for the rest of the flight." Her words were calculated, trying to assert authority once again. She was trying to regain her position of power, but there was a quiver in her voice that Maya didn't miss. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence linger, her composure unshaken. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, and she knew that whatever Karen was attempting to do, she couldn't let it slide. It was clear now that Karen wasn't interested in being reasonable. She wanted to humiliate Maya, to assert her dominance, and to make sure no one ever questioned her authority again. Maya's voice broke the silence, calm and deliberate. "I'm fully aware of the situation, Karen, and I'm more than willing to cooperate, as long as you do the same." Her words were a gentle challenge, a reminder that while Karen could attempt to intimidate her, she wasn't going to be cowed. Karen's lips tightened, and for a moment Maya saw a flash of something dangerous behind her eyes, a mix of anger and frustration. Karen had spent decades mastering control over the people around her, and Maya had just shattered that carefully constructed facade with one simple act: standing her ground. The older woman had underestimated her, and now she was paying the price. "Listen," Karen said, her voice softer now but still tinged with venom. "I don't want any more trouble, but I can't let this go. You're pushing things too far. There's a lot more at stake than just a seat assignment." She glanced around, making sure the other passengers could hear her words. "If I were you, I'd reconsider my attitude." Maya sat up straighter, her expression unreadable. "And if I were you, I'd remember that I'm a paying customer and not some person you can push around. You're the one making this difficult, not me." The exchange was brief, but Maya could feel the shift in the cabin once more. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, their glances darting between the two women. Others, however, seemed to be slowly coming around to Maya's side, recognizing the subtle power shift in the air. Maya could almost feel the divide among the passengers. Those who wanted to side with Karen, seeing her as the authority figure, and those who were beginning to see through the older woman's manipulation. Karen gave a curt nod, her face flushed but her posture stiff. She wasn't going to win this battle here, not with Maya standing so firmly in the way. "This isn't over," she said with finality, her voice low but edged with a threat. "We'll talk about this when we land." Maya's response was measured, not a word of defiance but a simple acknowledgement of the truth. "We'll see about that," she said, her tone cool. Karen turned and strode away. But this time, her retreat wasn't as confident as before. There was no smirk this time, no triumphant wave. Instead, it was a quick, almost desperate movement, as if she were retreating to regroup, but not willing to fully acknowledge her defeat. As the flight continued, the hum of the engines filled the cabin once more, but the air between Maya and the other passengers had changed. There was a subtle shift in how people viewed her, no longer just a passenger, but someone who had stood up for herself in a way that commanded respect. Maya leaned back in her seat, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her bracelet, her gaze drifting toward the clouds outside. The battle wasn't over, but Maya had shown Karen, and everyone else, that she wasn't going to back down without a fight, and she wasn't going to let Karen's venom poison this flight any longer. The next move was hers to make. The rest of the flight passed in an eerie quiet. Passengers had returned to their own thoughts. The brief altercation between Maya and Karen now an undercurrent rather than the main event. Maya leaned back in her seat, her mind sharp and focused. The whispers that had once echoed throughout the cabin had softened, but the tension was still palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Despite the fleeting moments of calm, she knew the battle wasn't over. Karen had already shown she wasn't willing to let things go without a fight, and Maya wasn't about to underestimate her again. Across the aisle, Evan Holt continued to observe the unfolding drama. His interest piqued. The businessman had made his judgment. Maya was no stranger to power, and he recognized the quiet strength she exuded. He was no stranger to corporate warfare either. What fascinated him was the way Maya navigated the confrontation. There was no visible panic, no overt defensiveness. She had faced adversity before, but this was different. This was personal, a battle over who controlled the space, who had the right to be seen as legitimate. Maya was no longer just the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. She was a woman proving her worth in a world that was too often quick to judge her. Evan sipped his bourbon, his mind shifting between the interaction in the cabin and the thought that had been growing inside him. He wasn't a man who often involved himself in the messier side of things, but Maya intrigued him. This wasn't just about a seat in first class. It was a story about a woman's struggle to be seen as she was, without the lens of prejudice distorting her place in the world. And he couldn't help but wonder how this would all end. He already had an inkling, but he wasn't in a rush to see the conclusion. Behind Maya, Laya was still silently filming, her phone now securely tucked in her lap. She had witnessed Maya's composure, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and it only deepened her fascination with the woman. Laya wasn't sure where this story would go, but she knew it was bigger than just one moment. There was something about Maya's quiet resilience that felt like the beginning of something larger, a shift in the way people would perceive power, class, and race in a confined space like this one, a quiet revolution. Tim Ruiz, the junior flight attendant, was once again stuck between two worlds. He had filed the report that confirmed Maya's seat was legitimate, but his allegiance to Karen weighed heavily on him. His conscience, however, was starting to crack. He had seen Maya's unshakable confidence and the way Karen had tried to manipulate the situation. The more he thought about it, the more his unease grew. The truth was becoming clear, but he wasn't sure if he had the strength to stand up to Karen. The fear of losing his job, of becoming an outcast among the other crew members, gnawed at him. Maya noticed Tim's hesitation as he walked past her again, tray in hand. His eyes flicked toward her for a split second before quickly looking away. But Maya didn't take offense. She understood his struggle. Fear was a powerful force, especially when the stakes were high. She knew Tim was caught in a crossfire, but it was only a matter of time before he would have to choose a side. Would he remain loyal to Karen, or would he do what was right? Maya could only wait for him to figure it out. As the plane soared through the sky, Maya's thoughts turned back to her ultimate goal, to ensure this never happened again. Karen's behavior was unacceptable, and it wasn't just about the seating incident anymore. Maya had faced prejudice before, in boardrooms and high-stakes meetings, but never quite like this. It was clear Karen's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a system that was built to keep people like Maya in their place. It wasn't just about one woman asserting her dominance. It was about a world where the color of her skin made her an outsider, even when she belonged in every way. And that was something Maya would not stand for. She wasn't going to let Karen, nor anyone else, define her worth. As the flight continued, Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She had made it this far, fought for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let one flight attendant's ego get in her way. Karen may have had the power to intimidate, but Maya had the power to expose the truth. And that was something no amount of control could ever take away. The plane's descent was slow, as though the very air itself was weighed down by the tension inside the cabin. The closer they got to their destination, the more Maya felt the pressure mounting. She couldn't let her guard down. Not now, not when Karen had proven she was willing to go to any lengths to maintain control. Maya's fingers traced the edge of her gold bracelet again, a small but constant reminder of the strength she had fought for her entire life. In the galley, Karen was fuming, her face flushed with anger. She was whispering heatedly to the senior flight attendant, her words too soft for Maya to hear, but the frustration in her voice was unmistakable. Maya knew Karen would try something else, and she had no intention of letting her have the last word. Karen's need to be in control was all too clear, and now it was becoming her weakness. Maya's gaze shifted to the other passengers. They were mostly quiet now, some pretending to read or scroll on their phones. But Maya could feel their eyes on her. Some still looked at her with doubt, while others seemed to shift their perception, slowly moving from suspicion to something more sympathetic. She was no longer just a woman caught in a petty disagreement. To some, she was a symbol of defiance, someone who refused to let a system of privilege determine her worth. Across the aisle, Evan was still watching, his eyes thoughtful. He had been observing the subtle changes in the cabin dynamic, and he was starting to appreciate the gravity of what was unfolding. Maya wasn't just defending her seat, she was challenging an entire structure. For someone who had built her empire quietly and with grace, he realized she had a much larger purpose now. Maya wasn't just playing to win a small victory. She was using this moment to change the game entirely. In the back of the cabin, Laya had her phone out again, the screen reflecting her intent gaze. She had already filmed the critical moments, the slap, the scanner confirmation, but now she was holding back. Maya's calm resolve had turned her into a reluctant hero in this drama, and Laya could sense the turning point. She wasn't just documenting the conflict between two women, she was capturing the shifting tides of power and perception that had been at play for far too long. Tim, meanwhile, was still moving through the cabin, tray in hand, but his nervous glances and tight posture told a different story. Maya knew he was struggling with his conscience. The report he had filed, confirming her seat, had been a key piece of evidence. But now, with the cabin turning against her and Karen growing more desperate, Tim was faced with a choice. Would he continue to back the woman who had tried to humiliate Maya, or would he finally do the right thing? It wasn't a question of loyalty anymore. Maya had already seen what Tim was capable of. He was a man caught in the middle, too afraid to stand up to Karen, but not willing to fully betray what he knew was true. The real question was whether Tim could find the courage to stand up for what was right before it was too late. Because Maya knew, if he didn't, Karen would use him as an instrument in her final act of retribution. The flight continued, but the final destination was more than just the airport. The real destination was the inevitable moment when Maya would be forced to confront Karen once and for all. She had the power to change this narrative, if she played it right. But the longer she waited, the more Karen would try to rewrite it for her, and Maya couldn't afford to lose this fight. Not now. Not when everything she had worked for was on the line. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, signaling the final approach to the airport, Maya straightened in her seat. The tension had reached its peak. She could feel it in the way the passengers were now looking at her, some with curiosity, others with judgment, but all with a sense that something was about to happen. This wasn't just a small altercation anymore. This was a moment that would define the rest of the flight, and Maya wasn't going to let it be her defeat. The moment had arrived. Maya could feel the plane beginning its final descent, the cabin lights flickering slightly as the plane tilted downward. The hum of the engines shifted, becoming more pronounced. But her thoughts were far from the mechanics of F. Instead, they were consumed with what was to come, the landing, and more importantly, how Karen's increasing aggression would play out once they were on the ground. Maya had no illusions. She knew Karen would escalate, and the moment they landed, everything would change. She straightened in her seat, her mind as sharp as it had ever been. She had no intention of allowing Karen to drag her through another round of humiliation. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. Maya's ability to maintain her poise in the face of Karen's passive-aggressive tactics had already become a silent battle in the eyes of the passengers. Some, no doubt, had sided with Karen, believing the older woman's attempts to maintain order were justified. But Maya had noticed something shifting in the eyes of the others, a subtle but growing shift toward her. It wasn't just the force of her presence. It was the truth, the calm clarity with which she confronted the situation. And the passengers were starting to notice. Across the aisle, Evan's amusement had turned into quiet contemplation. He had been watching Maya closely, trying to assess what kind of woman she truly was. It was one thing to have the title of CEO, but it was another thing entirely to carry the weight of that position with the kind of grace and quiet strength Maya displayed. He was used to seeing power wielded loudly, with pomp and circumstance. But this was different. Maya wasn't loud. She wasn't brash. But she was formidable. He could see now that the situation was more than just a seat dispute. It was about something much deeper, a struggle for respect, for dignity, for identity. And in this battle, Maya had already won the first round, simply by not allowing herself to be rattled. In the back of the plane, Laya's mind was racing, her phone still tucked into her lap. The footage she had captured earlier, Karen's outburst, Maya's unwavering response, was crucial. It was the moment that could tip the scales. She had already begun drafting a post, preparing to expose the truth of what had happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. There was more to the story. And while the footage was valuable, it wasn't the full picture. Maya's silence, her strategic calm, was what made the situation more complicated than just a viral post. Laya knew she needed more, something that would give Maya the ultimate weapon against Karen's manipulation. But as the plane's wheels touched down, Maya couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. She was ready for whatever came next. But she knew this wasn't the final act. Karen was just getting started. The landing would mark the beginning of a new phase in their battle. Maya could almost hear Karen's voice in her head, laced with venom, ready to escalate things further. But Maya had one thing Karen didn't: control over her own narrative. The ground was approaching quickly, and Maya was already mentally preparing for the fight that lay ahead. This wasn't just a battle for her seat. It was a fight for her dignity, her identity, and everything she had built. And she wasn't about to let Karen take any of it from her. The cabin grew still as the plane neared the runway, the final moments before everything changed. As the plane came to a complete stop, the airliner settled into its gate with a soft jolt, but the tension in the cabin remained palpable. Maya's heart beat steadily, her eyes scanning the other passengers as they began to stir in their seats. Despite the landing being over, the flight wasn't yet finished for Maya. It wasn't the end of the conflict, it was merely the transition into the final phase. She knew Karen would strike the moment they disembarked. The flight attendants' earlier threats hadn't been mere posturing, they were a sign of what was to come. Maya had already anticipated that, and while she couldn't completely predict Karen's next move, she had learned enough from this encounter to know one thing for sure: Karen would not let this go. And as Maya's fingers brushed the edge of her bracelet again, she knew she had to be prepared for the fight that was inevitable. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and a murmur spread through the cabin as passengers began gathering their belongings. Maya remained seated, taking a slow, deliberate breath as she waited for the doors to open. She felt Karen's gaze on her, a lingering presence that threatened to undermine everything she had worked for. Maya wasn't concerned about the passengers' judgment anymore. She could already sense a shift among the people in the cabin. Many of them now looked at her with sympathy, with respect. She could feel it in the way they avoided eye contact with Karen, and in the subtle nods from a few who had caught on to the truth of the situation. Then, as expected, Karen appeared in the aisle, moving purposefully toward the front of the plane. She was back to business now, her voice a little louder, her movements sharp and controlled, but there was no denying the slight tremor in her hand as she collected the final drink trays from first class. It was a small sign, but Maya noticed it. Karen's mask was starting to slip. She was trying to regain control, but Maya was no longer afraid. Not of her, and certainly not of the situation. As the last of the passengers unbuckled and began to stand, Maya remained still in her seat. She wasn't rushing to leave like the others. She had to stay focused. She had to stay calm. Evan Holt, still seated a few rows back, gave Maya a final glance before standing and reaching for his briefcase. His face, which had once been amused, was now thoughtful, almost intrigued. He had been watching the entire dynamic unfold and, to his surprise, he was beginning to understand something. This wasn't just a dispute between two women. It was a reflection of the larger forces at play in society. Maya's struggle was a battle for identity, for space, for authority in a world that was quick to question whether someone like her should even belong. And as much as Evan might have been entertained by the drama earlier, he knew this wasn't something he could just watch without some personal reflection. Maya had already shown him more than he expected: grit, intelligence, and the kind of quiet power that couldn't be denied. As the final few passengers disembarked, Maya's eyes flickered to the flight attendants. Karen was now standing near the front, directing the last few passengers toward the exit, her back stiff as she tried to regain her composure. But it was clear. Karen's facade was beginning to crumble. Maya stood slowly, taking one final look at the cabin, as if preparing herself for what was to come next. But as she moved toward the aisle, a voice cut through the tension. "Miss Ellison, could you please wait for a moment?" Karen's voice rang out like a sharp, controlled command. Maya turned, her brow furrowing, already anticipating the confrontation she knew was coming. She had expected this, but the time had come to deal with it. She was ready. As Maya stepped into the aisle, she could feel the weight of every step. The buzz of the cabin seemed to fade as Karen's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Miss Ellison, could you please wait for a moment?" The words, meant to assert control, carried a sharp edge, but Maya was already preparing herself for this moment. She had anticipated that Karen would try to confront her, but it didn't matter. Maya's mind was clear. This was the moment to finish what had started back in the air, to make her voice heard. Maya paused for a brief moment, her hand still gripping the armrest. Her posture remained composed, though her heart raced just slightly. This wasn't just a confrontation about a seat anymore. This was about standing up for herself, for her dignity, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small by the kind of subtle prejudice Karen had been wielding. She turned slowly, her gaze steady, locking eyes with Karen, who was standing near the front of the cabin, her uniform crisp and her expression carefully controlled. Maya didn't need to say a word at first. Her presence in that moment, her quiet strength, was a response in itself. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in Karen's eyes, the brief hesitation before the flight attendant cleared her throat and spoke again. "Ms. Ellison, I'm afraid I have to report a few things before we can allow you to leave the plane. Your behavior today has raised some concerns, and I must ensure that everything is in order before you disembark." Maya's lips barely moved as she replied, her voice calm and measured. "I'm aware of what you're implying, Karen, and I'm more than willing to cooperate. But I expect to be treated with the respect I deserve. Let's not make this any more complicated than it needs to be." Karen's face flushed a shade of red, her hands tightening around the clipboard she had been holding. She hadn't expected Maya to respond like this, not with fear, but with a level of authority that mirrored her own. For a brief moment, Karen seemed to lose her grip on the situation, her composure faltering. "I'm simply doing my job," Karen said, but there was a hint of desperation in her voice, the underlying frustration beginning to seep through her professional mask. Maya stood her ground, not backing down an inch. She wasn't going to let Karen twist the narrative anymore. "I understand you're doing your job, but there's a line, Karen, and you crossed it when you decided to treat me differently simply because of who I am." For a moment, the cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the flight attendants seemed to pause, caught between the tension of the two women. The other passengers remained still, unsure of what was happening, but sensing the gravity of the situation. Maya could feel the eyes on her, some curious, others wary, but she could also feel a shift. There was a growing sense of solidarity, a silent recognition of her quiet defiance. But Karen wasn't going to let this go so easily. Her jaw tightened, her grip on the clipboard now white-knuckled. "I've been a flight attendant for 25 years, she began, her voice edging on the defensive. "And I've never had to deal with this kind of situation before. I'm just making sure things are handled properly." Maya's expression remained unchanged, her voice still measured. "I understand that, but you're not in control of this narrative anymore. I am, and I'm not going to let you manipulate it to suit your agenda." The challenge in Maya's voice was undeniable. It wasn't just about seating assignments anymore. It was a fight for her identity, her space, and the way she was treated in this world. She wasn't just a CEO or a passenger. She was a woman who had fought against an unfair system her whole life. And today, that system was staring her in the face in the form of Karen Whitaker. Maya stood tall, her body language radiating the same strength she had built over the years. She knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever faced the kind of systemic bias that Karen represented. She wasn't going to let it go, not this time. For a long moment, Karen simply stared at her, as if trying to decide what to do next. Then with a final, sharp breath, Karen snapped her clipboard back into place and looked around the cabin, her eyes briefly meeting those of the passengers before focusing back on Maya. "I'll be reporting this," Karen said, her voice lower now, laced with a finality that only partially masked her discomfort. "And you'll be hearing from Solaris Air's corporate team when we land." Maya nodded, the corners of her lips curving ever so slightly. "I'll be happy to speak with them." Karen turned on her heel, her face a mask of frustration, and Maya finally began walking toward the front of the plane, the weight of the moment sinking in. She knew Karen's part in this story wasn't over, but this time, it wasn't about winning. This time, it was about making sure the truth would be heard. As Maya walked toward the exit, her movements deliberate and calm, she could sense the eyes of the passengers following her. There was an underlying murmur in the cabin, a ripple of unease that hadn't been there when they first boarded. They were no longer simply witnesses to a petty seat dispute. They were seeing something deeper unfold before them. A woman unapologetically claiming her space, not just in first class, but in the world. She could feel the weight of the judgment, yes, but there was something else too. Respect. It wasn't just about what she had earned. It was about the quiet dignity she refused to compromise. The passengers may have been confused or uncertain at the beginning, but now they were beginning to understand. They had seen Maya handle Karen with a grace and strength that was undeniable, and that left an impression. Maya reached the front of the plane where Karen stood, still holding her clipboard like a shield. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and palpable. The door was just a few feet away, the threshold to freedom, but Karen wasn't going to let her go without one final attempt at asserting control. "Ms. Ellison, I expect you to cooperate with my report when we land," Karen said, her voice now tinged with something darker. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Her earlier facade of professionalism had cracked, revealing something more personal beneath. The embarrassment was starting to set in, and Maya could sense it. She was trying to save face, but it was clear that Karen had underestimated her. Maya turned slightly, glancing back at her with a calm expression. "I'm happy to cooperate, Karen, but I won't stand for being treated like a criminal. You've made your assumptions, and now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The words landed, heavy and true. Karen's lips pressed together, her cheeks flushed with frustration, but she said nothing. She knew Maya was right. There was no going back now. The passengers had seen it. The truth was inescapable, and Karen's authority had been questioned. Maya's heart was still steady, even though the stakes had risen. It was no longer just about her seat or her dignity. It was about something larger, a fight against a system that still thought it could dictate who belonged where. Karen had tried to take that from her, but Maya had refused to back down. And now, as she approached the door, ready to step off the plane, she knew she had won. The small, quiet victory was hers. But Karen wasn't done. The flight attendant had clearly been caught off guard by the shift in the cabin, by the way the passengers had begun to rally behind Maya's calm resolve. This wasn't just a moment of personal pride for Karen. It was a defeat, and she was struggling to accept it. As Maya stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, she felt the cool air brush against her skin. It was a relief to finally be free of the suffocating tension that had gripped the cabin. She had survived, and now it was time to turn the page. The real work, the real battle, would begin when she faced the corporate team. But for now, she could breathe a little easier. Behind her, Karen remained on the plane, but Maya could almost feel her presence, like a dark shadow lurking and ready to pounce. Maya wasn't fooling herself. The fight was far from over. But this was the first step, the first piece of the puzzle, and whatever came next, Maya was ready to face it head on. No more hiding, no more caving to unjust authority. She had claimed her power, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. Maya stepped off the jet bridge, her footsteps steady but her mind racing. The moment she had anticipated, the moment she'd been preparing for, had arrived. She had walked through the storm on the plane, but now she stood on solid ground. Or at least she thought she did. The weight of what was coming next hung over her like an invisible cloud. The airport terminal was buzzing with activity as passengers flowed through the gates, but to Maya everything seemed muffled. She could hear the muted sounds of the crowd, the beeping of the security scanners, and the shuffle of footsteps around her. But her focus was elsewhere. She had passed through the gates, yes, but the real challenge was waiting on the other side. As she moved through the crowd, she could feel the eyes of the people around her. Not the judgmental eyes she had faced on the plane. No, these were different. These were the eyes of people who had witnessed a quiet revolution, of people who knew something had just shifted. Maya had always been the kind of person who operated in the background, building an empire brick by brick without drawing too much attention to herself. But now the world knew who she was. Maya Ellison, CEO of Solaris Air, had been forced into the public spotlight in a way she never expected. And as much as she was ready for the challenge, there was an uncomfortable truth she couldn't shake. Karen's battle was far from over. The plane had been just the beginning. What came next would test Maya in ways she hadn't yet imagined. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She fished it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Laya. "I've got the footage, Maya. Everything's ready for when you need it." Maya's lips curled into a tight smile. Laya's footage had already gone viral, a tidal wave of support from passengers and outsiders alike. But that wasn't enough. Maya knew she needed to be careful. The stakes had just been raised. She couldn't afford to act recklessly. The corporate team would be waiting for her, and she had a lot to explain. But it wasn't just about saving face anymore. It was about securing the future of Solaris Air, a company she had built from the ground up. The tension in her chest tightened again as she thought about the challenge ahead. She glanced around, taking in the familiar sights of the airport, gate signs, the hum of intercom announcements, the smell of coffee brewing from nearby kiosks, but nothing felt normal. Not anymore. Her life had changed. She had changed. In the distance, she spotted a few familiar faces. Two of her senior managers from Solaris were waiting near the exit, their expressions neutral but alert. Maya's breath hitched for a moment. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of briefing they had received. Had they been told the full story? Or had they been fed Karen's version, the one that painted Maya as the villain? Either way, she knew they would be watching her closely. She had to handle this with the same precision she had used to build Solaris. Any slip-up now could cost her everything. She adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, taking another deep breath, and started walking toward them. As Maya approached her senior managers, she could see the tension in their eyes. They weren't here just to greet her. They were here for answers. The corporate team had likely already been briefed by the time her flight landed, and whatever version of events Karen had painted, Maya knew it would be twisted in ways that could put her in a difficult position. It wasn't just about regaining control over her seat on the plane anymore. It was about her career, her future, and the reputation of Solaris Air. Miss Ellison, one of her managers, Thomas, greeted her with a stiff nod. He was a tall man, always impeccably dressed in his tailored suits. His face was unreadable, though his posture betrayed a certain wariness. "We were expecting you to meet with corporate immediately." Maya didn't flinch at his words, though she knew what was coming next. "I'm aware. Let's not waste time. I need to know what they've been told about the incident." Thomas hesitated, exchanging a glance with the other manager, Karen, no relation. But the resemblance in the name felt almost ironic in this moment. Karen's jaw tightened as she shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. "They've been informed that there was a disturbance on the flight. The staff report suggests some—" Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. Unusual behavior from you. Maya's eyes hardened. Unusual behavior. Please, if we're going to have this conversation, let's be clear. I wasn't the one who caused the disturbance. I was simply standing up for my rights as a passenger, and I won't apologize for that. Thomas glanced at Karen for support, but she didn't offer any. He nodded slowly, as if weighing Maya's words carefully. We understand your position, Maya, but the situation has escalated beyond just a seating issue. Karen Whitaker, the lead flight attendant, has claimed that you were disruptive. She's already made accusations of you threatening the crew and attempting to undermine the flight's operations. Maya felt her blood run cold at the mention of those words. Undermine the flight's operations? Karen had really gone that far. She had no doubt that Karen would do everything in her power to make Maya look like a troublemaker. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about painting Maya as a danger to the company. I want to see those reports, Maya said firmly. Now, if Karen wants to make those claims, let's examine the evidence. Karen looked almost taken aback by Maya's directness, her lips parting as if she was about to speak, but then closing quickly, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Thomas, however, nodded and quickly pulled out his tablet. I'll get them for you, but Maya, he paused, glancing at her cautiously. You have to understand, the higher-ups are already concerned about the public reaction. The footage of the altercation has spread widely. People are questioning whether this could affect the company's image. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Maya felt the weight of her situation. She had done everything she could to keep Solaris Air afloat, to keep the company above the fray. But now her personal struggle had become a public spectacle. She was the face of the company, and as much as she tried to compartmentalize, the two were no longer separate. Her actions would reflect on Solaris, and there was no way around that. I'm not going to let this company fall because of someone's personal vendetta, Maya said, her voice steady, but her resolve firm. If they want to use this to discredit me, they'll have to do it in front of the whole world, because I'm not backing down. Thomas didn't reply immediately, but Karen's eyes narrowed at Maya's declaration. The tension in the air was thick, but Maya didn't waver. She had fought too long and too hard for Solaris Air to let it crumble now, especially not because of one woman's grudge. I'll have the report sent over, Thomas said, his tone now almost apologetic. But we should get to the meeting. Corporate is waiting. Maya nodded. Lead the way. As they walked toward the meeting room, Maya's thoughts raced. She had prepared herself for a fight, but now she could feel the gravity of it pressing down on her. This wasn't just about winning a battle with Karen. It was about the future of Solaris Air, and she wasn't about to let anyone destroy that. When they reached the meeting room, Maya took a moment to steady herself. The next steps would define everything. She had to play her cards carefully. Everything hinged on how she responded to what was coming next. Maya sat at the head of the conference table, her posture straight and composed. But inside, she was fighting a storm. The room was sleek, cold, a sterile space where decisions were made and lives were altered. The high glass windows gave a panoramic view of the city, but Maya's gaze wasn't on the skyline. It was on the people gathered around her. The corporate team, Solaris Air's board members, and a few legal experts, all waiting for her to speak. The last few hours had been a blur. After her tense conversation with Thomas and Karen, she had been escorted into this room where the stakes were far higher than any seat assignment or personal confrontation. Karen's accusations, now amplified by viral footage and public outcry, had turned her into a target. And it wasn't just her reputation that was on the line. It was the future of Solaris Air itself. She hadn't been in many boardroom battles like this. Most of her decisions had been made with quiet authority, hidden behind closed doors, far from the media frenzy. But today was different. Today she was no longer just Maya Ellison, the CEO. She was Maya Ellison, the woman accused of misconduct, a woman whose image was now tainted by the lies of one disgruntled employee. She had never felt so exposed. The board members were seated in a semicircle, their eyes flicking between her and the various documents laid out before them. They had already heard the story, Karen's version of events, the claims of a disruptive passenger, the rumors of a security risk. They had seen the footage, the stills of the altercation on the plane, the way Maya had stood her ground. They had been briefed on Karen's supposed professionalism, her years of service, and how she had acted in the best interest of the passengers. But what none of them seemed to understand was how one woman's power trip had escalated into this. What Karen hadn't counted on was Maya's refusal to shrink under pressure. She had played the role of the composed, polite passenger, and yet somehow she had been made the villain. The irony was almost painful. She had spent years building Solaris into a company that stood for integrity and excellence. And now here she was, fighting to defend her very integrity. So Ms. Ellison, one of the senior board members, a middle-aged man with glasses perched low on his nose, began, "Can you explain what exactly happened on that flight? We've seen the footage, but we need your side of the story." His voice was polite, but there was an edge to it, a quiet demand for clarity. Maya knew exactly what he was implying. This wasn't just a formality. He wasn't asking for a story. He was asking for an explanation that would satisfy the shareholders, the investors, and anyone else with a stake in Solaris. She had to give them something more than just words. She had to make them see the truth, the whole truth. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke, her voice steady but cutting through the tension in the room like a sharp knife. "I'll start by saying this. I didn't ask for any of this. I simply asked for respect as a paying customer. And what I received was a baseless accusation, followed by a public humiliation." The room was still, all ears on her now. She knew this was her moment, the moment she could take control of the narrative, reshape the story they had all been fed. "I was accused of being disruptive, accused of threatening the crew. But none of that is true. The only thing I threatened that day was the false narrative that Karen Whitaker wanted to create. I did not cause a disturbance. I simply stood my ground." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. But as she spoke, she could feel the board members shifting, their expressions unreadable. Were they buying her story, or was she about to lose everything she had worked for? The tension in the room was suffocating, and Maya knew she had to be careful. Every word, every move had to be precise. Maya could feel the weight of their silence, the eyes of the board members pinning her in place, like they were assessing whether she was telling the truth or simply trying to cover up a situation gone wrong. She knew better than anyone that the truth wasn't always enough in situations like this. People didn't just listen to what was said, they listened to who was saying it, and in her case, the power dynamics were all wrong. She was the CEO, yes, but she was also a black woman, and the way people saw her, and the way they wanted to see her, had shifted. "Ms. Ellison," the senior board member continued, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed, "we understand that tensions were high, and we can see from the footage that there was a clear conflict. But these things escalate quickly. Were there any moments before the incident where you could have de-escalated the situation?" Maya clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She had been preparing for this. She knew they'd try to get her to take some of the blame, paint her as someone who could have prevented the incident if only she had handled things differently. She had been trained to do damage control in meetings like this, but this time, she wasn't going to let them turn her into the villain. "De-escalation would have been possible, yes," she replied, her voice unwavering, "but not at the cost of my dignity. Not at the cost of letting someone treat me like I don't belong." The moment Karen crossed the line, she made it clear that she wasn't just questioning my seat on the plane. She was questioning my place in the world, as if I was somehow undeserving of that seat. I couldn't let that slide. There was a shift in the room, a subtle change in the atmosphere. Some of the board members exchanged looks, and Maya could see the wheels turning in their heads. This wasn't just a disagreement over a seat anymore. It was a question of how far people would go to uphold systems of power and how much they were willing to overlook when those systems were challenged. Ms. Ellison, another board member, a woman with a sharp, calculating gaze, spoke up. "While we understand the emotional aspect of this, we need to consider the bigger picture. The optics of this situation, especially with social media now in play, could seriously damage Solaris's brand. We've already seen negative feedback coming from passengers. They're asking why an employee like Karen, with 25 years of service, was disregarded by a passenger, regardless of their status." Maya's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. It's always been about status, hasn't it? She said, leaning forward slightly. Karen's 25 years of service should be respected, yes, but that respect should not translate into an automatic assumption that she is always right. We all have biases, and if she can't see that, it's not my job to accommodate that. It's my job to hold Solaris to a higher standard, one that doesn't let employees or passengers abuse their power just because they feel entitled to it. The words landed hard, and for a moment, Maya could almost hear the collective intake of breath around the table. She had said what they didn't want to hear, what they didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't just about Karen, it was about the system that allowed her to act in such a way. And now Maya was challenging that system. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every other person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible, to feel like they didn't belong. The room fell silent again. Maya's mind was racing. She knew the board members would be processing her words, wondering if they could afford to back her. The pressure was mounting, but Maya knew this was her fight. It was never just about this one incident. It was about what it represented. She was reshaping the narrative, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. But as she looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not just doubt, but uncertainty. Maybe they were starting to see things her way, or maybe they were realizing just how hard it would be to sweep this under the rug. Either way, Maya knew the outcome of this meeting would shape the future of Solaris Air, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the hum of the office around her barely registering. The glass walls of her corner office offered a sweeping view of the city below, but today the skyline felt distant, unreachable even. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the aftermath of the boardroom meeting. Despite her firm stance, despite speaking her truth, the road ahead was still unclear. The board had promised to review the situation, but Maya knew better than to trust their promises without seeing action. Everything was in flux. The uncertainty loomed over her like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Laya's name flashed in bold letters. Maya picked it up, bracing herself. "Hello? Hey, Maya!" Laya's voice came through, steady but tinged with urgency. "I need you to see something." Maya felt her heart rate pick up. "What's going on?" "I've been tracking the social media posts from the flight," Laya said, her voice quick. "And there's something strange happening. The footage of you, the altercation, has sparked a whole new wave of commentary. There's a group out there trying to paint you as the villain, as a disruptor. But here's the thing. They've started accusing you of planning the whole thing. It's growing fast." Maya leaned back in her chair, the words hitting her harder than expected. She had known that Karen's smear campaign would have a ripple effect. But this felt different. "You're telling me they've turned this into something worse?" "Exactly," Laya responded. "It's like they found a new angle, and it's being shared across multiple platforms. They've got screenshots, theories, and even fake insider sources. They're framing this as a calculated attack, and the worst part? Some of the board members have seen the posts. I've got a feeling they might be buying into it." Maya's mind raced, her grip tightening on the phone. The idea of her own actions being twisted into something malicious, something premeditated, was almost too much to bear. She had always been a calculated leader, yes, but never a manipulator. She'd never wanted this fight. But now it seemed that the narrative surrounding her was no longer just about a confrontation with Karen. It was about her integrity, her character, her reputation. "I've seen what they're saying, Maya," Laya continued. "I'll send you everything. But this is big. It's not just social media buzz anymore. People are really buying it. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Maya exhaled slowly, trying to steady her thoughts. She had known this fight wouldn't end in that conference room. It had only just begun. "I'm going to handle this," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm not going to let them rewrite my story. I built Solaris Air from the ground up, and I'll be damned if I let anyone tear it down now." Laya was silent for a moment, and Maya could almost hear the wheels turning on the other end of the line. "You need to get ahead of this. If you don't, they'll have control of the narrative, and that's exactly what they want." "I know," Maya said, her voice resolute. "I'm making a plan. I'll need your help with this. I'm going to expose them. Show everyone who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes. Laya's voice softened, but Maya could sense the unspoken trust between them. Count me in. I'll do whatever it takes to get the truth out. Maya hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her office for a moment. The storm outside seemed to mirror her inner turmoil. Dark clouds gathering, lightning crackling in the distance. But Maya wasn't afraid of the storm. She had weathered worse. What was coming next, however, would demand every ounce of her focus, her strategic mind, and her unwavering belief in what Solaris stood for. The stakes had never been higher. Maya stood up from her desk and paced across the room, her mind racing. She needed a plan, an airtight strategy that would put the narrative back in her hands and expose Karen and those behind her. The longer she stood still, the more the weight of the situation pressed on her. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, could be shattered in a moment by a lie, and Maya wasn't going to let that happen. She picked up her phone again, dialing her trusted legal advisor, Ethan. He had been with Solaris since the beginning, and he was someone she trusted to see the bigger picture without being swayed by the noise of public opinion. Maya, I'm here. What's the latest? Ethan's voice came through steady, but Maya could tell he was bracing for the battle ahead. Ethan, I need everything. All the legal angles. I'm about to go public, and I need to make sure we've covered all our bases. I'm not just fighting for my reputation anymore. This is about Solaris, our brand, our integrity. It's at risk. I understand, Ethan replied, his voice sharp with focus. The first thing we need is to ensure Karen's claims don't hold water. If they're pushing this narrative of you being a planned disruptor, we need to find inconsistencies, track everything, social media posts, statements from passengers, anything that can back up your version of events. Maya nodded, already organizing the pieces in her head. Laya's sending me the screenshots, the theories. They're all over the place, but there's a clear pattern. Someone's feeding this, and I think it goes deeper than Karen. Ethan was silent for a moment before speaking again. If that's true, then we need to bring this to light, and fast. We're talking about a smear campaign that's targeting not just you, but the entire company. The board is already wavering, Maya. You need to be the one to take control of this narrative. Maya's grip on the phone tightened. I will. I've built this company with integrity. I won't let anyone drag it through the mud without a fight. Good, Ethan said, his voice firm. I'll gather everything we need, but be prepared. This won't be easy. There's a lot of damage control to do. Maya hung up the phone, taking one last look out the window. The city below seemed so distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. But this was her fight, her battle, and she had no intention of losing. The world needed to know the truth. She wasn't going to be defined by a false narrative. She would expose Karen's lies and, in the process, show the world that Solaris Air was stronger than any smear campaign. Maya had always been a woman of action. This would be no different. She took a deep breath and went to work, outlining a series of steps that would cut through the noise, lay bare the truth, and make sure that everyone, from the board to the public, knew exactly who the real villain was. Her first step was clear: contact the media. She needed allies who would help her control the story, people who would stand with her as she exposed the deeper forces at play. She knew the truth would rise, but it had to be on her terms. As she drafted an email to a select group of influential journalists, her phone buzzed again. It was Laya. I've got something big, Laya's voice crackled through. I just spoke to a few passengers from the flight. They're starting to question Karen's version of events. Some of them are even willing to go on the record. We might have a chance to shift the tide. Maya's pulse quickened. This is exactly what we need. Let's get them on the record then. Send me everything you've got. It's time to make our move. This was just the beginning, but already the tide was starting to turn. The lies that had been so carefully woven were beginning to unravel, piece by piece, and Maya once again was in control. Maya sat at her desk, the weight of the decision ahead pressing heavily on her shoulders. The emails had been sent, the strategy had been set in motion, but now she faced the hardest part of all: waiting. The room was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The hum of the city outside seemed distant, a far-off world that had nothing to do with the storm she was bracing for. Her phone vibrated on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. Laya's name flashed across the screen, and without hesitation, Maya picked it up. Maya, Laya's voice was urgent. We've got movement. The media is starting to take a closer look. People are starting to question Karen, and it's spreading. Maya leaned back in her chair, a small sigh of relief escaping her. The first piece was falling into place. How fast is it moving? Faster than I thought, Laya continued. The passengers who came forward, they're speaking with journalists now. There's even talk of interviews. This isn't just a ripple anymore. It's starting to feel like a wave. Maya's mind raced. She had expected the media to turn on her first, to paint her as the villain. Instead, the truth was coming to light. Karen's accusations were unraveling faster than anyone could have anticipated. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Maya needed more. She needed to push forward, to stay ahead of the narrative before the board had a chance to take another step backward. Good. Keep the pressure on them, Maya replied. We need to make sure the board hears about this. They've got to see what's really happening, not just what Karen is feeding them. I'm on it, Laya said, but you've got to be ready. The board's going to call you back in soon, and when they do, they'll have to take sides. If they know the truth, they'll be forced to choose. Maya stared out the window, the weight of Laya's words sinking in. The boardroom was where it all started, and it was where it would end. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to slip up, for her to falter. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Maya had built Solaris from nothing, and she would defend it with everything she had. The board might have been her allies once, but now they were potential enemies. Maya, Laya's voice snapped her back to the conversation. The tide is turning. You're doing the right thing. Maya nodded, though Laya couldn't see the gesture. She wasn't just defending her seat at the head of the company. She was fighting for Solaris's future, for the people who had believed in her and the mission they had built together. Thanks, Laya, she said softly, her mind already calculating her next move. I'm going to need everything you've got. The next step starts now. As she ended the call, a deep sense of determination settled over her. This battle wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about reshaping the way Solaris was seen by the world. And if Karen thought she could take Maya down, she was gravely mistaken. With the media picking up momentum and Laya's updates rolling in, Maya knew it was time to take the next step. The meeting with the board was coming, and this time, it would be her turn to speak. Maya took a deep breath and stood from her desk, walking over to the large glass window of her office. The city below seemed so calm, so unaware of the storm that was building inside Solaris Air. The media buzz was growing louder, the social media posts spreading faster, but she knew there was still more work to be done. It wasn't enough to expose the truth. She needed to make sure the board, her last line of defense, understood the stakes. They needed to see how much was on the line, not just for her, but for the entire company. She straightened her blazer, taking one last glance at the skyline before turning back to her desk. The meeting with the board was imminent. She had to be ready to face them, prepared to speak her truth and steer them in the direction she needed. Her plan was clear: force the board to see the full scope of Karen's sabotage and show them that siding with her was a betrayal of everything Solaris stood for. But there was one more piece she needed, a final piece of leverage to push the board into action. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she drafted a message to Ethan, her legal advisor. She needed everything, every piece of evidence, every public statement, every detail about the media's growing coverage. She wasn't going to just play defense anymore. This time she was going on the offense. The door to her office opened just as she hit send on the message. It was Tim. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, but there was a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. Maya had known from the moment he helped her with the burner phone that he had the potential to be an ally, even if it had taken him some time to come around. She had seen the guilt in his eyes when he'd helped expose Karen's lies. Now he was standing in front of her, no longer the unsure junior flight attendant, but someone who had witnessed the truth and couldn't stay silent anymore. Ms. Ellison, Tim began, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. I wanted to apologize again for everything, for not speaking up sooner, but I've been thinking about what happened, about what Karen did. It's not right. and I want to help you however I can." Maya met his gaze, her expression softening. "You've already helped her, Tim, more than you realize." She motioned for him to sit, and as he did, she continued, "But I need you to do more. I'm going to face the board soon, and they need to see that this isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about integrity, about the kind of company we want to be. I need you to be a part of that." Tim looked at her with a mix of admiration and fear. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to speak the truth. I need you to be willing to stand up in front of the board and the media, if necessary, and tell them what you saw, what Karen did, what she tried to do to me, to this company." Tim swallowed, the weight of the request sinking in. He knew that speaking out could cost him more than just his job. It could mean losing his place in the company entirely. But Maya's words hit him differently now. He had seen the power struggle unfold before his eyes. He had seen the lies, the manipulation, in the attempt to silence someone who refused to stay quiet. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "I'm in," Tim said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Maya gave him a nod of approval, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Tim. This isn't just about one person. It's about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about taking control of the story and showing the world that Solaris stands for something bigger than any one person's agenda." Tim stood, his shoulders less tense than before. "I'll be ready." As he left the office, Maya felt a sense of purpose settle in. This wasn't just a battle for her seat. This was a battle for the soul of Solaris Air, and she wasn't going to lose. Not now, not ever. The storm that Karen had started was only growing, but Maya was ready to weather it. She was ready to show everyone that the truth couldn't be buried, no matter how hard they tried. The boardroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Maya Ellison stood at the head of the table, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The faces around her were a mix of disbelief and resignation, their eyes shifting from Maya to each other, unable to escape the weight of the decisions that were about to be made. The room was full of power, but Maya had long since learned that true power wasn't about the position you held. It was about the strength you commanded, the integrity you stood by. The board had already been presented with evidence, with witnesses, with facts. Each piece of the puzzle slowly coming together, revealing the truth behind Karen Whitaker's lies. The media had picked up on the story. The passengers who had witnessed the chaos were speaking up, and Maya's allies, Laya and Tim, had given her the ammunition she needed. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, there was still one question left to answer. Would the board stand with her, or would they fall victim to the same bias that Karen had exploited? Maya didn't allow herself to feel the weight of their stares. She couldn't. Not now. She was in control, and she needed them to see that. "We've heard a lot today," Maya began, her voice calm but firm. "We've seen the footage, we've heard the testimony, but the real question isn't about Karen Whitaker's actions. The question is this: what kind of company do we want Solaris to be?" The board members shifted uncomfortably, and Maya could see the hesitation in their eyes. They were trying to balance their own survival with what was right, and it wasn't easy. But Maya wasn't about to let them off the hook. "Do we want to be a company that stands for truth and integrity?" She continued, her eyes locking onto each member around the table. "Do we want to be a company that rewards loyalty, that champions fairness, and that rises above the petty politics of personal vendettas? Or do we want to be a company that lets fear and prejudice decide who stays and who goes?" Maya paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. No one spoke, and in that moment Maya felt the full force of the years of hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears she had poured into Solaris. This was her life's work, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Then one of the board members, Gerald Thompson, an older man with a reputation for being the most cautious of the group, cleared his throat. "Maya," he said, his voice low, "this has been a complicated situation. We've seen the evidence, yes, but we're also facing a very public crisis. This isn't just about what happened on that plane. This is about the company's reputation and the trust of our investors. We have to consider all the angles." Maya could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't backing down. Gerald, you're right. It is complicated. But this isn't just about what happened on that plane. It's about how we handle the truth. We can choose to sweep this under the rug, pretend it didn't happen, or we can choose to confront it, to make it a defining moment for Solaris, to show the world that we won't tolerate corruption, we won't tolerate injustice, and we won't let anyone, no matter how powerful, tear us down. There was a collective pause, and for the first time since the meeting started, Maya saw a flicker of understanding in the board members' eyes. Gerald looked at the others, his fingers tapping on the table. Then he turned back to Maya, his expression softer than before. I think we all know which way this is headed, he said quietly. Let's do the right thing. Maya nodded, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She had done it. They were finally listening. This was the moment she had been working for. As the meeting drew to a close, the decision was unanimous. The board voted to remove Karen Whitaker from her position and issued a public statement in support of Maya. Solaris Air was not just going to survive this, it was going to come out stronger, united, and with its integrity intact. But even as Maya walked out of the boardroom, a sense of unease lingered. The battle with Karen was over, but the war with the forces of prejudice and corporate corruption was far from finished. Maya knew this victory was just the beginning. There would always be another challenge, another test of her resolve, another fight for what was right. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Solaris Air had not only survived, it had been reshaped, and as long as she was at the helm, it would continue to rise. The storm was far from over, but Maya was ready for whatever came next. She had faced down the worst of it, and now she was more determined than ever to make sure the future of Solaris was built on a foundation of truth, justice, and unshakable strength. The end of one chapter marked the beginning of another, and this time Maya wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever believed in her, and for every person who would come after her. Maya stood at the threshold of the boardroom, her heart still racing as the final words of the meeting echoed in her mind. Let's do the right thing. Gerald's quiet approval had been the turning point, but now the weight of that decision was starting to settle in. The board's unanimous vote had sealed Karen Whitaker's fate. She would be ousted, her reputation irreparably tarnished, and Solaris Air would begin the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. There was no denying the relief that flooded Maya, the feeling of triumph over the forces that had once threatened to crush her. But that sense of relief was fleeting. The victory, while hard-won, felt incomplete, almost hollow. There was still the matter of the public's perception, the investors' trust, and the underlying rot that had allowed someone like Karen to gain so much power. As she walked down the long corridor of Solaris's headquarters, Maya's thoughts drifted back to the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. The slap, the coffee spill, the wallet planted in her bag. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, but the emotional toll still lingered. The attack on her dignity had been relentless, yet somehow she had emerged victorious. In this moment, she had proven to herself and to everyone watching that she was not easily broken, but that strength, that fortitude, had come at a cost. Ms. Ellison? A voice called from behind her, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Tim, the flight attendant who had become an unexpected ally. His face was weary, but there was a new sense of respect in his eyes. Maya, he corrected himself, stepping forward. I just wanted to say, thank you for everything. Maya smiled faintly, her eyes softening. You were the one who did the hard work, Tim. Without you, I don't think any of this would have turned out the way it did. Tim shook his head. I was just doing what was right. What you did, standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us. It means more than I can put into words. Maya gave him a grateful nod, the weight of his words sinking in. She had fought not just for her seat at the head of the company, but for the integrity of Solaris Air. And in doing so, she had changed something much larger than herself. She had created a ripple, one that would be felt throughout the entire company and beyond. But the victory had come with a realization. The fight was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles. And this fight, against the toxic undercurrents of prejudice, corruption, and the forces that sought to keep people like her out would never truly end. It wasn't just a battle for Solaris, it was a battle for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or held back because of their identity. As Maya stepped out of the building, the cool evening air hit her face, grounding her. She looked out over the city, the skyline bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. For a moment, everything felt still. Her mind was quiet, her body tired, but the fire inside her was far from extinguished. She had done what she set out to do, but there was always more work to be done. A sense of purpose filled her as she made her way toward the waiting car. She wasn't just going to rebuild Solaris, she was going to reshape it. The company would be a beacon for integrity, equality, and innovation. The world would see that no one, no matter who they were or where they came from, was beyond redemption or opportunity. And though there would be more storms ahead, Maya was ready, because she knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. And whatever came next, she would face it head on. With her truth as her shield and her resilience as her sword, there was no force, no person, no system that could take her down. The future of Solaris Air was in her hands, and she wasn't about to let it slip away.